Thanks everybody, and it's just delightful to be here with all these wonderful radical feminists. Fantastic. And thanks for RadFem Collective for organising this. I'm very grateful. Make somewhere where we can talk about theory. Now, back in 1984, one of the main theorists, in fact the main theorist, lesbian feminist theorist of sadomasochism, a woman called Gail Rubin, wrote for a conference on sex at Barnard College a paper called Thinking Sex. And that was a tremendously important paper. The reason we know that is it was published as the very first paper in loads of anthologies on lesbian and gay theory. Gay men loved it. It was very taken up by queer theory. There were even women's studies collections with it at the beginning. Now, what the paper says is it was a response to, in fact, the development of theorizing sexuality that radical and revolutionary feminists had been doing in the previous 10 years, which worried some women a great deal. And Gail was very worried about that. So in her Thinking Sex piece, she said, first of all, she said that all of the perversions were actually the future and the most exciting and revolutionary thing about sexuality, including paedophilia. She's got that in there. But she also said that feminists should not be looking at what gay men do sexually, because it's nothing to do with them. Feminists should just look at rape, that's it. They shouldn't look at sexuality generally. Because feminists lack the angles of vision, they're kind of blinkered. They lack the angles of vision to really understand all of these things. They should just look at rape, that's it, folks. Which was fascinating, because it was obviously showing that what we'd been doing in theorizing sexuality was very significant, because we'd been looking at everything gay men do, everything heterosexual men do, in great detail. And it was causing ructions. So she was really the sort of, the resistance to us, trying to reframe sexuality as being about the excitement of sadomasochism and so on. She did mention me in the article. Somehow she'd got to know about me in America, and she was cross about what I was doing, and she said something pejorative about me. So that's even in 1984. So an interesting battle's been going on for a long time. So in a way, probably I should have called this paper Rethinking Sex, because it's a riposte. But the conference is on theorizing, so I've called it Theorizing Sexuality. Okay. So what I'm going to do now, in a very brief time that I have available, is look at some of those ideas we were creating in the 70s and 80s, which we all very well understood, but some of them will probably be new to some women becoming involved in feminism now. So I'm rehearsing those arguments, and I'm giving a few up-to-date examples as to what we should be looking at now and what they mean at the moment. Right? So, if we just think about how sexuality is normally thought about, as Ruth was saying, what we did was, as feminists, we had to go in there and unpack everything and had to theorize and resist all the common sense ideas. And the common sense view of sexuality is that it's natural and innate. Heterosexuality is assumed to be normal and ordained by a higher power. And homosexuality is seen as a perversion, probably the result of a biological flaw. And male sexuality is seen as naturally aggressive. Women are seen to love their subjection. And these prejudices were maintained by the church until the late 19th century, when the role of policing sex transferred to the medical profession. And the sexologists, the scientists of sex, promoted these patriarchal prejudices as if they were scientific truth. In more recent times, the industry of pornography has risen as a more powerful force in constructing sexuality and patriarchy, but it constructs sexuality exactly the same way that the sexologists did, as male dominance and female subordination. In many cases, the two industries of sexology and pornography interact, with sex therapists recommending pornography use as a good manual for sex and so on. So the two industries are very linked. Now, I will argue today, and radical and revolutionary feminists always have argued, that sexuality is political. There's nothing natural about sexuality, and I think this is an important thing to remember through everything that I'm saying. I'm saying there's nothing natural, okay? And that's a controversial idea today. We argued, Catherine McKinnon, me and others, that sexuality isn't just a hobby like stamp collecting or a way to reproduce, but is intensely political, lying at the very core of the oppression of women. Women's oppression is based on biological sex, but it is the mechanism of sexuality, we argue, that functions to organise and maintain it. It is, after all, in heterosexual sexual activity, and this is something that we were talking about a lot back in about 1978, is that in heterosexual sexual activity, that the symbols of your position in the hierarchy of male power are wielded, the penis and the vagina. They come together in this thing called sex, generally. We'll talk a bit more about nappy fetishism later on. Now, sex is the explosive point of contact between the oppressor and the oppressed. And this explains why it's so central to the culture of male supremacy and why there's so much fuss about sex. But we'll talk a bit more about why there's so much fuss about sex later on. There is no other system of oppression in which something like that happens, that the symbols of their position in the hierarchy comes together in such an explosive way. Now, fundamental to all of the theorising that we did back in those days, and that I do today about sexuality, is that it is socially constructed. Now, no political analysis of sexuality is possible without the crucial understanding that sexuality is socially constructed. And this is contested today by some feminists, and particularly by some lesbians. But none of what I say today is thinkable without this understanding. All feminist analysis is based upon social construction. This is not a particularly feminist insight. In the 1960s and 50s and 60s, social scientists, including sociologists and anthropologists, developed the knowledge that human behaviour, instead of being ordained by God or biology, was socially constructed. This was crucial knowledge if any progress towards social justice and the liberation of oppressed peoples was to take place. The oppression and even enslavement of black people, for instance, was justified by saying that they were, by their very nature, inferior in intelligence, social behaviour, talents, and so forth. And this racist myth was debunked in the 1960s when the notion that intelligence was ordained by biology was overthrown. The same myths have functioned in relation to economic class and poverty, the poor being seen as an inferior class of persons not capable of ruling, perhaps not even deserving the vote. And I won't sing to you, but you will know the words from All Things Bright and Beautiful. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, he made them high and lowly, he ordered their estate. Okay, some people will always be poor, they should be poor, and that's just how it is because that's who they are. I should have sung it really, shouldn't I? We need a bit of singing, and it's a nice hymn. Now, these myths sustain the status quo and they justify oppression and exploitation. In relation to women, the myths have been pernicious too, the main one being that of natural sex roles, or what we now call gender, that women naturally like to be subservient in their behaviour, clothing, work, etc. This means that lipstick, which was introduced in Babylonian civilization to show which women were prostituted slaves, is seen as a natural rather than as a way of creating an engorged set of labia on the face to demonstrate readiness to fillet men. Now, women are seen, according to gender, as naturally liking high heels, toilet cleaning, all of that sort of stuff. So that all had to be overthrown. The understanding that human behaviour was socially constructed rather than ordained was then revolutionary in the best way. The social scientists developed this knowledge. In developing the knowledge included sexuality, and the best known social constructionists in relation to sexuality from that time were the anthropologists Ford and Beach, with their 1953 book Patterns of Sexual Behaviour, and also, of course, Margaret Mead, who many of you will know of, in her many books such as Coming of Age in Samoa and so on. These anthropologists pointed out that what was seen as natural in one culture would be seen as very unnatural in another. So in other words, the behaviours were socially constructed. Only a small minority of cultures, for instance, consider that kissing on the lips is acceptable. Many find it disgusting. And when you think about it long enough, you might decide that actually it is. Right? However, in this culture, it is ordained to be the correct behaviour. Also, forms of homosexuality, particularly for men, if not exclusively for men, are seen as natural in many cultures, and historically, some cultures such as ancient Greece saw the use of boys by adult men as completely normal and absolutely the thing to do. Whether we want to call that homosexuality because it's their love in it, and we're not even going to have that discussion. But the behaviour, a sexual behaviour with a person of the same sex in some cultures, usually men, is seen as ordinary. Afghanistan is a culture in which it's approved, and boys are very much used. Okay. So, feminists of the women's liberation movement then came out of and reflected in their thinking the fundamental understanding that sexuality is socially constructed, and this understanding makes revolution possible, because if it is constructed, it can also be reconstructed. We are now in a much more conservative time, when biological determinism reigns in terms of sexuality and gender. It's a frightening and alarming time to look out upon, in fact, compared with the revolutionary time that we were in then. Now, so I'm going to go through a few of the ideas that come from understanding sexuality to be socially constructed. Particularly, I'm going to look at the construction of male sexuality and the effect upon women of men's sexual behaviour. First of all, looking at male sexuality and the way that works in the social control of women. Now, all of the feminist insights into the political role of sexuality show that it is constructed to maintain the oppression of women. Some of the ways in which the construction of sexuality serves male dominance are more obvious than others. It is probably clear to everyone here how the expression of male sexuality creates a reign of terror for women which keeps us in our place. And in the 1970s we used to call this male violence as social control. We started from the political understanding of how social control was exercised by the state against dissidents, and the possibility of revolution by the police, and if necessary by the army. That is political control by the state. And in the case of women, these forces are not necessary, because individual men control what women may do, where women may go, through sexual harassment, rape, sex, murder, and so on. There are certain occupations, for instance, which women may only do at risk to their safety, and I don't mean prostitution, which is obviously extremely risky. Any occupation in which women meet clients at their homes and are unaccompanied may put women at risk of murder. For instance, Susie Lamplugh was an estate agent who disappeared in the middle of a working day while showing a client around a property in 1987, and there is now something called the Susie Lamplugh Trust, organised in her memory. Women taxi drivers, social workers, all have to consider their safety. They are at risk of death as they go about their occupations. The threat of men's sexual violence controls where and when women may walk. For instance, 22-year-old comedian Eurydice Dixon was murdered as she walked through a park on her way home in Melbourne, very close to where I used to work at the University of Melbourne, this year by a young man and for sexual purposes. The threat of rape or death are enough to limit women's access to public space, even if they do not experience sexual harassment themselves. They will see it in the newspaper. They will know somebody has been killed. Most women here today have probably experienced indecent exposure. Are there any women in the room who have never experienced flashing or indecent exposure? Please put your hand up. It's 2, 3. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Okay, so I think I'm probably correct, therefore, in that assumption. I experienced it several times as a child, and I remember reading in my mother's Woman's Own magazine that children who had several such experiences could be seen as accessing parks and open spaces because they were deliberately seeking it out. That must have been me. Yeah, I used to go and play and collect newts and play with conkers and do all kinds of things that were quite unacceptable for a girl child. So I was seeking it out. Now, the boys and men who do this practice, the waving of the symbol of their dominion to frighten girls and women, have the effect of establishing public space as male, that the rest of us venture into at our own risk. Now, women in the women's liberation movement did not have virtual space to worry about. So that is something new that we need to be doing new kinds of theorising about. Now, of course, men prowl online space and social media with similar tactics to exert their authority and control over space. The dick pic is the more modern form of flashing, but the traditional variety does still take place all the time. They're just added to their armoury, I think it's reasonable to say. And women certainly may not have virtual space, let alone public space of any other kind. I don't have time to talk about virtual space here in any length, but there is a great deal to say, not today. Men's sexual violence then performs a useful function for male dominance, and it is not surprising that it is not seen as important or political, because actually it is functional to male domination, and very important that it should continue. Now, another understanding that we had at the time, and in fact I've written quite a bit on this, is the way in which Sexuality is constructed under male domination to represent the eroticizing of women's subordination. It's a less obvious way, perhaps, but the fact is that women's sexuality is constructed from a position of powerlessness and consists of eroticizing their own subordination. Women are not equal, women do not have power, so they're not in political positions to eroticize equality or power, but to eroticize their own subordination. The likelihood is then that many women will experience sexual excitement from masochism. Girls and women are the objects of male sexual attention from childhood onwards, and from a position of being objectified and harassed, they have to construct the ability to be sexually interested in their oppressors. Not an easy task. When you think about it politically, it's very strange that indeed it should happen at all. Now, the sexologists saw it as very important to the maintenance of male domination that women respond sexually to their being sexually used by men through the eroticizing of their subordination, because this would lead to their subjection in all areas of life, not just the bedroom. As a result, they were in a state of panic in the 1920s at the idea that women were not properly surrendering to men in sex, because actually there was a feminist revolution going on, and this could make women, they thought women were becoming very uppity. So in the 1920s, sexologists were wondering whether it was actually only 40% of women were frigid, or perhaps as many as 100%. This did not put them off the task, the major task that they had had, which was to make sure that women were excited by their subordination and had the right kind of sexual response. And that's why a whole industry of sex therapy has been created over the last 100 years. Right? You're very aware of how big it is and what's going on. That is to make sure women do surrender in the proper way. And my favourite example of how women's sexual surrender creates wider surrender to male power and control is a wonderful 1950s book called The Power of Sexual Surrender by a woman psychiatrist. Power of surrender, kind of opposites. And she said it was very good for women to surrender to men. She said, gave two examples. She says, one woman came to her unable to orgasm, and she was a critical wife who objected to things such as her husband just dropping his knickers on the bathroom floor and expecting her to deal with them. She was taught to have an orgasm, and then she just picked them up. Another woman who was unable to have an orgasm did not want to uproot herself and her children and follow her husband to the other side of the country for a job. When she was taught to have an orgasm, she happily followed him. The sexologists created sex therapy, therefore, as an industry to coax, cajole and threaten women into servicing men's sexual demands and correctly surrendering in the bedroom and in all the rest of life. Now, I'm going to leave some bits out because I need to move swiftly on. Here. Now, the importance of sex in keeping women down explains why there's such panic about women's reluctance to do it and why it's generally seen to be of such huge importance. It's not neutral sex, it's not a hobby like train spotting. It's not because it might be fun, but because it's crucial to the maintenance of women's subordination that they do it. Women who refuse are seen as resistors and all kinds of abuses directed at them, and I'm sure you're very aware of that, and particularly, of course, at lesbians, because we are resistors and we do refuse to do it. And therefore very dangerous, which is good. Male sexual behaviour, how does it come to be the way it is? How is it socially constructed to be the way it is? We gave a great deal of thought to this, of course, because we wanted to understand it in order to make sure that it could be changed. We understood that ordinary male sexuality was constructed out of their position of power in relation to women, so it was going to be aggressive and objectifying, because that's what learning sexuality in that power position actually produces. So it's fairly easy to understand men's everyday sexual behaviour, but it's more difficult to understand what were called the sexual perversions by the sexologists, the unusual forms of male behaviour, many of which related to the usual forms, so they were just more extreme forms that men engaged in. And we theorised about this in a group called the Patriarchy Study Group, which was formed in 1978. And we explain in the book that came out of our work, the Sexuality Papers, in 1984, that we had set ourselves the task of understanding men's perversions because there were certain things that we found interesting that we wanted to understand. For instance, one of them was, why did men go to prostituted women to eat their feces off teaspoons? We thought, that's interesting, we need to explain it. And why, we wondered, would men doing anal sex to a woman ejaculate when the tip of their penis touched feces, right? Interesting. So we gave ourselves the more difficult task, you see. If we can understand that, we will be able to understand a lot of the rest of it, okay? We were doing this in 1984, but I don't think anybody's doing it now. And really, that is the task ahead of us. Now, we knew that the reason for the differences in sexual behaviour between men and women was that they were in a power relationship. But how could we understand all of this? So what we decided was that men are not in heterosexuality relating to their equals, but to a subordinate class of persons, and a class, moreover, that they are trained to see as dirty and disgusting. For instance, women have periods, and men have always found periods terribly, terribly disgusting. How do you express love and sex towards someone who is your dirty, disgusting subordinate? Inferior? I mean, it's an interesting question, politically, right? So that will shape the way that men are able to respond. And we decided that the moment of great sexual excitement was the one at which they overcome their disgust. They face it and react to it. Feces on teaspoons explained. And it explained many other aspects of the sexual perversion, such as men's sexual excitement or the debasing of women in saleromania, which is one of the sexual perversions. They access their excitement by dirtying women through mud wrestling, for instance. And an anecdote that I thought came from Sandra, and she says it doesn't, which was of a woman walking down the street. Somebody told me this, in a white coat, a man comes up and manages to tip red paint on her, presumably symbolising blood, and says to her, "Oh, I'll give you some money, go to the cleaner on the corner." She goes to the cleaner on the corner, who says, "Oh no, not another one, he's always doing that." Right, so the moment of ejaculation for him was when that stain went onto the coat. Now, the best evidence for the social construction of male sexuality is the way that men's behaviour is shaped by pornography, because many of the sexual practices that are becoming fairly routine come from pornography. Anal sex is completely routine now, believe me. Back in 1969 or whenever I started to become sexually active, heterosexually, actually men were pretty terrified sexually. Nobody asked me to do anything peculiar, and certainly nobody did anal sex. But now what's happening in the pornography, and it will presumably shape the next phase, is prolapse. Men do rough sex to women's anuses or cervixes so that body parts fall out and become visible, right? So we've got prolapse eating, prolapse fucking, prolapse fuck, extreme anal punch fisting, prolapse cervix out, and pussy fisting. Cute prolapse rosebud. When the bits of the body are coming out, they're called rosebud because that's what they look like. Female anal pumping, four-way prolapse rosebud fest. Watch wrecking her anal rosebud prolapse cervix. Okay, so quite soon, I suppose, that will be what women are expected to experience. And we do have situations where teenage girls are having to wear butt plugs because already their bodies have been so damaged by these practices. So the point by telling you this is that men learn. They were not doing any of this in 1969, 1970, but they are now. So you can see very clearly how sexual practice is not natural at all, but is actually very, very much constructed. Now, I just want to say a little bit about sexual liberation. What has taken place largely in connection with the development of the pornography industry is the liberation of what were once seen as sexual perversions out of the private realm of fantasy and into public space, as men have created a sexual rights movement, demand toleration or embrace of their practices. So all of the ones that were in private are now out on the streets and in public place as a result of the pornography industry. Saleromania and coprophilia, which are the ones we were talking about, shit-eating and dirtying women, they were called perversions then. Then more recently they're called paraphilias. I don't know whether we're going to see a lot of it about, but I guess we are. You know, more and more of these become rights movements. We see this, of course, in transgenderism, where what used to be called cross-dressing or transvestism, and the sexologists knew it was about sexual masochism on the part of men. There's no doubt about that right up to the 1970s. Nobody's saying anything else. Nobody is suggesting that these men become women and so on. Everybody knew they were what was called sexual perverts, now paraphiliacs. Right? But now there, of course, a rights movement developed to defend this particular sexual practice, which is having a dramatic effect upon women's lives. And gradually the defence of more and more of these practices, of course there's a defence of paedophilia going on at the moment, as you know, as minor attracted persons. We fought that in the 1970s as feminists, and they are doing it all over again. And in fact, some of the old characters who were campaigning to do sex to children in the 1970s are still there. They've come back, and they're out there in the literature saying things now. So it's very interesting. In the next book, I'll cover all of that. Now, so what's happened to the perversions is they've become mainstream. And as each one gets the imprimatur of the state, as cross-dressing has today, a more extreme demand is being incubated and about to become a rights movement. Okay? I just want to say, and I know I don't have a lot of time left, I want to say something about the social construction of heterosexuality and lesbianism. Following their understanding that sexuality is socially constructed, lesbian feminists in the women's liberation movement argued that heterosexuality was not just innate, but had political significance, that heterosexuality is an institution constructed and maintained by patriarchy, including the law, social policy, the medical profession, therapy, psychiatry, the education system, aspects of culture, art, literature, the media, because it is the fundamental way in which male power is organised. It's much more than about who you fancy. I think often when we talk about these things, when we talk about choosing this and choosing that, we fail to remember that the vast majority of girls and women married in the world are in situations of actually being household slaves. They're exchanged between men, often money passes hands. They are sexual, reproductive and household slaves. That's the situation that they are in. Because heterosexuality extracts the 5 kinds of work from women, that's why it's there, that's why men are engaged in it. As well as being able to control women, what they do, it extracts 5 kinds of labour, which is emotional labour. You know, you can do it here at the interview the next day, you're wonderful, Harry. And there is typing up their thesis, economic labour. There is sexual labour, doing all the sex you don't really want to do. There's reproductive labour, which is having the children and rearing them. And there's ordinary household labour, which is cleaning the toilet, organising his shirts from the cleaners, doing a huge amount of things that the man never ever has to think about. There is more of a choice in relation to lesbianism, and indeed many thousands of us, including me and others in this room, became lesbians in the 1970s and 80s because we chose to do so. Right? Now, that was a hugely important part of our movement, choosing to do so. What happens now, because I say we've got back to this very conservative time, with a great belief in biology, is that the lesbians who chose to become lesbians and those who are doing so today are told they can't be real ones. They must be second class. They're straight-bians, or they must be bisexual and so on. They're second-class lesbians. They'll never get first-class status. They shouldn't aspire to it, and they're never going to be real lesbians. I get called a straight-bian, and goodness knows what else, right? So we're in a very difficult position now where that fundamental understanding of social constructionism has been very much overturned in this very conservative time. I'm going to write much more about this, all of it, in Keeping Their Peckers Up. And that's it for now. And hopefully I'll come back next year and tell you what's happening in that book. And that'd be nice. Okay.